Hello, everyone. In this screencast, we are going to work with a remote connection with a connection to a remote database, same database as we worked with last time through the terminal, the one at Smith College. But we're going to do it primarily through through R, but with some backup from the terminal connection. So the document that I am practicing with is a remote MySQL practice.rmd, remote underscore MySQL underscore practice.rmd that you'll find in the common folder on the server. So let's begin. And first of all, I'm in a new, fresh R session. So I've done a restart of R. And I have an empty global environment, so let's all start at that same place. We're going to use the package DBI, which lets us connect to databases in R. So we library it. And who knows, just in case we do any SQL, in case we do any dplyr type queries, we might want to library tidyverse. I don't know if I'm going to do that today, but hey, I'll just get ready in case. Clear that output. So we're first going to make the connection. And on the RStudio server, a great way to connect to a real live remote database is, again, with the db connect function, but the driver for it is the ODBC driver that comes from the ODBC package. This has some really neat consequences for RStudio, as you'll see in a moment. You do need to specify the driver software that would be installed on your computer to sort of run the client that is interfacing to that remote database. It's good to specify some initial data table in the database that you plan to connect to. That parameter may or may not be ignored. Depends sort of from one database to another. You do need to give the URL for the server, and you do need to say your username, and you need to say your password. Ordinarily, you would not hard code your password into a file like this because they need to be secure, and you would instead draw the password from some external file at this point. But we're just students, and this is an open connection, so we're practicing. So let's set up the connection. And something really cool happens over here in the upper right-hand corner. The environment pane is no longer on top. Something called the connections pane is on the top. And it is showing us all of the databases, that are in this particular database server. The first database at the top, information schema, is a special is a special table inside a MySQL server that contains information about how that server is set up and what kind of permissions different users have and so on. The other tables are, contain actual data that we're going to query. We'll be interested today in two of them, the Laman table, which contains the Laman database, which contains various tables, several more than you see in the Laman package in R, but it does have the familiar batting table and pitching table and the master table and so forth. If you wanted to learn about a particular table, like the batting table, you could click on it. and you get a description of all the columns in the table plus what type of variable every column is. So like player ID is var car. That means it's basically a character variable, and there's really no limit on how long that the string could be. And I think I have just enlarged my screen way too much. Once again, I'm probably not going to be able to salvage this session. Why does this happen? Thank you. So reset button is what I need. So let's enlarge it just a tiny bit more. There we go. Whew. Okay. So it's very convenient to have this connections pane. You can learn a lot about your tables this way. We'll also take a look at the airlines table, which is like the flights NYC 13, except that it has data from all the years up to the last time this database was updated, not just the year 2013. So it's really giant. But it has the familiar tables, airports and flights and weather and so forth. So we've made our connection. Just for reference here in lines 34 through 41, I'm showing you how you might make that connection on a local machine. My Mac just can't seem to make an ODBC connection well, but another package R MySQL has a nice driver that works just fine. You just don't get the same fancy screen up here under connections. So you need to say what database you plan to use, just in case your initial request when you made the connection got ignored. So you might as well do that through SQL with use airlines. So notice we have an SQL code chunk, and we specify that connection shall be the con that we set up, just like with our SQLite practice. So we're going to run that, and it always every SQL command is really a query, and so the answer always comes back saying like how many rows of data it's showing you, and so this time it shows you 0 rows. Let's show the tables that are in the airlines database. And there it are. It's the same tables we see up here in connections. Connections is really quite handy, isn't it? I should point out, because you see it a lot in the textbook, there's pretty heavy use of some DBI functions that essentially are SQL queries themselves, or that allow you to pass SQL queries to the remote server. So one example is DB list tables, which does about the same thing as show tables. It just gives the answer as a character vector in R rather than as some unrecoverable output to the console. Or you might want to see what are all of the variables, the columns in a particular data table, say airports. So if you specify the connection and the name of the data table you're interested in and ask to list the fields, then you get the names as a character vector. But again, you can get that kind of information just by clicking on airports over here, and you get the extra information of what type of variable each of them is in the database. Here we are describing carriers as well, and describing airports straight through SQL commands. Again, they give you information similar to what you can get by looking at connections, but more information in some cases. So, for example, when you describe airports, you not only get the names of the columns and the type of variables they are, but you get a description of whether or not null values are allowed in that column, and also the status of the column. Particularly, is it a primary key? Administrators of databases will set up certain columns to be primary keys when they are columns that are often used to join to other tables. It makes the joins go faster in SQL. Just a little commentary on types. Varchar 3 means that the code for the airport can be up to 3 letters long. Varchar 255 means the name of the airport can be as many as 255 characters. Latitude and longitude are real numbers, and they're decimal numbers, and the 10 and the 7 say how many places you're allowed, how many significant figures you're allowed, and how many can come after a decimal place. The altitude, I guess it's like feet above or below sea level, is an integer, and you're allowed to have 11 digits to it. So they're all different types of variables that you can have in MySQL. Similarly, when we describe carriers, again, we get the 2 variables. So the carrier is like the airline name, like United or Delta. And so they have an ID that's carrier, and they have a name that's their full name. So just a little sample query. Which 10 airports had the largest number of arrivals on April 1st, 2016? And so this turns out to be the query that works. I'll just go ahead and show it here. And so, as you might expect, the Atlanta airport comes out on top. It's a real hub for the whole country, and Chicago is not far behind. Dallas is third, and so forth. Now, I want to point something out to you. Like, suppose that you wrote this query up, but maybe you just forgot to filter down to where year is 2015, month is 4, and day is 1. Then you would be asking for what airports had the largest number of arrivals over the entire history of the database. So not just one single day, but over the thousands and thousands of days that they have data on. And I think it goes back to something like 1987. The query would be enormous. And if you were to dare to push this run button right here, you would get tired of waiting, and you would try to stop your R session, but really it's not the R session that's busy here, it's the connection to the remote database. And so about the only cure is really to have me come and delete a hidden folder in your home directory that kind of controls how RStudio is behaving, and you don't want to have that happen to you. I mean, if it happens, you can always email me, and when I get the email, I can sneak in and delete. But I want to just point out a tip for handling things like this. So I'm going to pretend to have forgotten that one line, and I'm going to go and work with that remote connection, or with that remote database, but through the terminal. So I'm going to set up a separate connection to the database through my terminal here. So let me get the password entered. Hope I spelled it right. And I'm going to use airlines. And I'll copy in this command, this SQL query, and I'll start it, and I wait, and I wait, and then I begin to suspect maybe I have a messed up query, or maybe it's just going to take too long. Well, you're in a very good situation here. All you've got to do is press Control C. Whether you're on a Mac or Windows, press Control C, and you will interrupt that query execution. And so you'll be back to the MySQL prompt. So that's a very nice thing to do. So what you might want to do is have that connection open in your terminal as a backup. And whenever you have a complex query that you're not sure about, enter the query in the terminal and then get it working in the terminal. And then you can have the correct query here in your R Markdown document. Another cool thing you can do with working through R that you can't do in the terminal easily is to save your results to data tables in R and for further processing or analysis or nice display. So here we have the same query, but notice that after a comma, I have added a code chunk option, output.var equals quotes popular. And when I run this code chunk, it appears there's nothing happening, nothing sort of comes out the console. But if you examine your environment, you're going to see popular here, along with your MySQL connection. And it's a database, 10 observations, 2 variables, and sure enough, they're your top 10 airports. So it's there for further analysis or display. I'm proving it's there here by just taking a glimpse. So why don't we switch tables now and just work with the baseball data a little bit. So we need to use Laman. And let's have a fairly complex query here that gets the top home run hitter in each league for each year since 1950. And you want to use his full name, first name followed by the last name. So here is where MySQL is expecting to see the concat function. And you should study this query on your own. It's just an example of how complex these SQL queries can get and what an athlete you end up having to be a good SQL user. The SQL is a whole world in itself. Not just the making of queries and the wrangling, but also the setup and administration of databases. It's a wonderful thing to make a career out of, being a database administrator. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this. Notice that we'll get a data table, home run leaders, and give it a try. So it was actually a fairly quick query. And here are the home run leaders. No surprises there. Those are the home run leaders since 1950, yes. But once you have that table, then in your R Markdown document, you could display the table in some nice way, as we are in the next code chunk. Now, we're getting to the point where maybe we're done. So the last thing that you'll want to do is, and always do this, is disconnect from the database you're talking to. The database itself will disconnect you if you've been inactive for a while, but it could have a lot of users, and it might need that extra time, and there's maybe a limit on how many it can listen to at one time. So it's very polite, good practice to always disconnect. We can do that in R through db disconnect. And what happens is out in the console, you'll see true would be what you would see afterwards. Now let's go back to the terminal. It's also polite to disconnect in the terminal, so we'll say exit, and it says bye to us. You should note that you can actually knit this document, and have it look pretty. And since some queries may take a while, once you are sure that a query is totally right, you can add the code chunk option cache equals true to it. And the first time through that you knit, it'll actually have to run the query, and but the second time that you knit, it actually will refer to a place where it stored the results of the query. There's a special cache folder that gets generated when you have a cache equals true in one of your code chunks. And it'll refer to that stored work rather than running all that code again. So cache equals true can be handy for some of your longer queries. So I'm going to go ahead and put cache equals true here for these two queries that took just a moment. And I'll go ahead and knit and see what happens. Here it is in the viewer. I'll pop it up. And there it is, very nice. The bare SQL queries get put as knitter cables, but that React table down at the bottom is very nice and fun to page through and so on. And you can search it as well. So if we were to run the knit again, it would run a little bit faster because of those caches. Well, I think that's about it. I'll go ahead and reset my size back down. And I'll go ahead and clear my global environment and maybe do a session restart R to be nice and fresh. Resize my windows. And I'll see y'all again next time. This is the last of the screencasts that I anticipate doing for database practice, but I'm sure we'll be talking quite a bit over the next few classes with your questions about SQL queries. See you later.